This is the Living Vernazzano podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
I'm Natasha.
I'm Brittany.
I'm Derek.
And we are the Living Vernazzano podcast, back with you again as we continue this journey that we have been on through the book of Romans. As a quick reminder, last week we finished off Romans chapter 10, looking at verses 14 through 21, where Paul continued his discourse on Israel's unbelief and God's actions in the midst of that unbelief. As from this passage, as we were talking, we discussed our calling as the sent ones so that the world may hear, believe, and call on Jesus. This week, we are going to be moving on into Romans chapter 11, looking at verses 1 through 10. And as a quick reminder, just kind of call back to last week also, this is the final chapter of that like three-chapter chunk that really focused on the Israelites and where they're at in this whole thing and where God's at in this whole thing and their relationship to each other. So this is going to be kind of rounding out that explicit conversation. And so verses 1 through 10 is, I guess, in essence, the intro to the conclusion of this conversation that Paul has been having through chapters 9, 10, and now 11. And so in these verses, Paul writes about the remnant of Israel and what that means. And I believe we have Brittany reading for us today. So Brittany, would you read Romans chapter 11, verses 1 through 10?
Yes, Romans chapter 11. I ask then, has God rejected his own people, the nation of Israel? Of course not. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, and a member of the tribe of Benjamin. No, God has not rejected his own people, whom he chose from the very beginning. Do you realize what the scriptures say about this? Elijah the prophet complained to God about the people of Israel and said, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. And do you remember God's reply? He said, No, I have 7,000 others who have never bowed down to Baal. It is the same today for a few people of Israel have remained faithful because of God's grace, his undeserved kindness in choosing them. And since it is through God's kindness, then it is not by their good works, for in that case, God's grace would not be what it is, free and undeserved. So this is the situation. Most of the people of Israel have not found the favor of God they are looking for so earnestly. A few have, the ones God has chosen, but the hearts of the rest were hardened. As scriptures say, God has put them into a deep sleep. To this day, he has shut their eyes so they do not see, and closed their ears so they do not hear. Likewise, David said, Let their bountiful table become a snare, a trap that makes them think all is well. Let their blessings cause them to stumble, and let them get what they deserve. Let their eyes go blind so they cannot see, and let their backs be bent forever.
All right. Thank you for reading that for us, Brittany. Let's go on into a conversation about these verses. And I guess just as we begin that conversation, I think it's once again appropriate to just remind us of how important it is to keep everything in context. And so at the close of our passage from last week, at the close of chapter 10, Paul worked through a few different Old Testament references, one from Psalm, one from Moses, and then two from Isaiah. And from these, even though Paul used them to prove essentially that God had not rejected his people, recognizing that this is a misconception, or maybe just a conception at this time that he needs to address as a misconception, he is continuing this conversation to address the misconception of God has rejected his people. And in so doing that, he opens in this chapter to say, I ask then, did God reject his people? So if he wasn't clear already in the closing of what we talked about last week, now he's just going to come right out and say it with a rhetorical question initially, and then with a exclamation in answer to that question, where he says, absolutely not. That's not what God has done. And so with that confident assertion of Paul in mind, we now move into the rest of this conversation here in verses 1 through 10.
And he follows that exclamatory statement right there in verse 1 with personal testimony, using himself as an example of one who, hey, remember, I'm an Israelite and I'm a descendant of Abraham and of the tribe of Benjamin. And remember, God pursued me. God didn't give up on me. And if God didn't give up on me, then he's not done with Israel yet.
Yeah, and if the personal testimony of Paul isn't sufficient, once again, he does what he does a lot throughout Romans and refers back to the story of Israel and stories throughout the history of Israel by bringing up Elijah. And I think it's easy, again, it's easy for me when I read this passage to just read Elijah, read the statements said about Elijah, and then just continue on without thinking really intentionally about everything that means. But for a Jewish Christian hearing this letter from Paul, like, they're not going to just hear Elijah and go, okay, Elijah, and move on. They're going to hear Elijah and hear all of, like, and be reminded of all the things that represented Elijah. And specifically, as he talks about, like, how Elijah runs away and then is talking to God about the prophets being killed and how he's all alone. Like, Paul is explicitly referencing this particular point in Elijah's story where he calls out the prophets of Baal and says, like, you know, I essentially challenge you to a duel of gods. If your God is God, then have him call down fire from him, have him set on fire your sacrifices to him, your offerings, and then I'll submit and say that your God is God. But I'll do the same thing, and I'll call to my God, and if he sets fire to the offerings here, then he is God. And he does the gentlemanly thing. He says, prophets of Baal, you go first. Yeah, you first. And so they're like, all right, we got this. And, they're doing all these things, cutting themselves, crying out, doing just anything they could possibly imagine to try to convince or coax Baal to respond and show himself as God. And nothing happens. And then Elijah, adds a few jabs and says things like, oh, maybe he's going to the bathroom and can't hear you. But then he raises the bar, soaks his altar, digs basically
with water.
a moat. Yeah, with water.
Not fuel.
Not fuel. No. Digs a moat essentially around it that's filled with water. And so it's like stacking the odds against him because he recognizes just who God is and calls out to God. And sure enough, it's consumed with fire. And so he faithfully is walking in line with God and working to testify to who God is and help others see who God is in this exchange and encounter with the prophets of Baal. And he's being very zealous for God. And then what results from this exchange, this encounter, yes, the prophets of Baal are put to death by the crowds around them, and they do see who the real God is. But it doesn't really go beyond that, because then when news gets back to Jezebel of what happened with the prophets of Baal, she loses it. And instead of her being kicked out because she's, believing in the wrong things, she immediately comes after Elijah and begins to persecute him. And so for his faithfulness to God, he ends up getting extreme persecution, and she wants his head on
From
a platter.
leadership,
Yeah,
so
from
it's-
leadership. And so he has to flee, and then he that's where we come in then with this prayer where he's talking to God, and he's like, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and they are trying to kill me. Like, I feel abandoned. I feel rejected. I feel like there is no, like you are far from me right now. Even though you showed yourself in the sacrifice, like you are far from me. It's like you've walked away from me. And God's response is, no, you're not the only one. There's still 7,000 other people that remain. And so when Paul recounts this story, like, this is everything that the Jewish Christians here in Rome are hearing. They're not just reading or hearing the 3 verses that Paul talks through here to remind them of the story. They're hearing the whole story kind of play through their mind. And they're being reminded that, that's true. Even though Elijah perceived that he was essentially being rejected or being kind of pushed away, pushed aside, God reminded him that he wasn't. Like, he not only was he not being rejected, but he also wasn't the only one. And maybe he just had a smaller understanding of the situation than the understanding that God had.
When I was reading through that, I wondered is the point of the story to, like, let them know that, hey, Elijah felt abandoned and he wasn't, or was it maybe a both and then to also, you are not alone. But I don't know. I was trying to figure out, like, because to me the end of it says, but I have 7,000 others. Like, you are not alone, but I don't know if it really fits in they're not really talking about feeling alone, right?
I think Elijah's heart was for the people of Israel. And so as he looks out at this, at the end of the day, what he really wants is Israel to be faithful, to be who she was called to be. And so to feel alone or to be placed into this group, well, no, you're not alone. You're actually part of this remnant. It puts you in this position of, okay, I'm this remnant, but I'm part of something that is God is working in or through. Part of this, as we've talked about on previous podcasts, part of this elect or this chosen group of people who are not chosen and then the others abandoned, but who are chosen to continue on this mission and to continue on journeying through this season of unfaithfulness in Israel, where they're worshiping these false gods, where they're, putting the prophets to death, but yet still God is choosing to work through the remnant, through a select group, to bring salvation still to the whole. He's not done with those. He's not dismissing the other. He's working through this group to bring salvation to all, which kind of ties back into our conversation that we had last week, where God's desire is that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved.
Right.
And so as we go back and we hold that in context and remember that's where we just came from, then we should expect that that's where this conversation here with Elijah is working. And that's what Paul is trying to draw the people of the church at Rome to understand as well. While Israel is being unfaithful, while they're missing it, while they aren't understanding, remember, there's this whole group of people through whom God is working that he wants to bring salvation to all of Israel. And so this is just the beginning.
Well, and I think in some of the things that I read, also some things that I was listening to about this passage over this last week in preparation for this conversation, the word remnant was addressed. And when we read the word remnant, it's very easy to think of the word leftovers. Like, this is what's left. This is what remains after X, Y, or Z, right? So the 7,000 that are the remnant that have not bowed their knee to Baal are the ones that are left out of everybody else who has chosen to bow their knee to Baal. The fact that in verse 5, he goes on and says, so too at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. Like, out of all the ones who were disobedient in the sense that they were depending on some kind of familial connection or like blood relationship to live into their chosenness, there are those who recognize that their chosenness is a result of their faith in God and not necessarily what they do in the checkoff list or what their bloodline is. And so you have Paul having this conversation about the remnant, but it's not the leftovers. If we, again, go back through Israel's history and we think about God choosing, the small, quote, remnant that exists every time is always the beginning. It's not the end. If you think about Noah, right? He starts over with Noah, and it's not what's left over. It's the beginning of what's to come. That's what Noah represents, the hope for the future. When you think about this story with Elijah and the 7,000, it's easy to think, oh, that's just the ones that are left over. But no, the reality is because God's redemptive plan is for all. He's saying there's 7,000 that are going to be able to start this work with you, to continue on in obedience with me and helping other people know who I am. It's not just the ones who have weathered the storm and now this is all that's left. These are the ones that God is choosing as his first fruits to offer up for all to know who he is. And so I think it's important for us as we read this passage, as we talk about this remnant that exists, like when we think about remnant as what's left, we do have this mindset where maybe we could understand why people would say that the Israelites are being rejected by God, right? But when we think about remnant as a first fruits conversation, you can't really get to the place where you're saying God is rejecting, because God is beginning to open the door to try to bring everybody in. But he's got to choose somebody to work through. Just like he chose Abraham to work through, just like he chose Isaac over Esau to work through. It's not that Esau was somehow less the person that Jacob was. It's just that he chose Jacob to work through. Just as he chose Moses. Like, it's not that Moses was the only one that could be used, but it's that Moses was the one he did use for everybody. And that is the conversation that Paul is having right now. Not that Israel has been rejected, but that there is a remnant that is a first fruits of what is to come.
And so it feels like it reinforces where Paul has already been. If we look back at chapter 10, verses 12 and 13, for there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The Lord is the Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And so if it is a continuation, like, who else do they have to share with? Like the Romans. So we obviously know they're not Jewish. And so it should like further prove the point that his desire is for all and not for just all of a group. Because like Paul has made that clear, it's not just for you. Like, you weren't just saved for yourself. We often say that, like, our salvation is not just for us. If it is, like, we're missing like this mission that we've been called to.
Right.
And it's like this reinforcement of the mission that, you know, their chosenness was a call to be the ambassadors of, or the priests of the good news. And so it's like a continuation of that.
Yep.
I think when you remember that all of this is God's choosing of you for mission, is an act of his grace, then and not anything that we've done has been a theme that we've talked about. We talked about it extensively between Jacob and Esau, how Jacob was chosen.
And in case we forgot, Paul says it again right here.
Right. And so God choosing to work through us to accomplish bringing his kingdom here is nothing we've done. Right. And it's not a result of anything we've done. And this is so pertinent, this message to the Romans at this time, to hear, hey, you following the law better or worse is not going to make God work through you any more or less. God is choosing who he is going to work through, and he is going to accomplish his mission through people as they are willing to obey and listen to what he's wanting to accomplish. And so it's God's grace that does it. It's not as we put our faith and belief in him enough to be obedient to what he's asking us to do. It's not by living out our religious rituals or traditions. That's not going to help us to find favor in God's eyes, so he'll pick me over someone else to accomplish his mission.
Well, I think this is really, for me, very encouraging that, he's telling the Jews this because they're working so hard. They're so focused on doing this thing a certain way so that they can garner whatever status they're looking for. And that helps me to know, even like for myself, in a world that is performance based, that everything I do is based, at my job, my performance at my job is judged, and I get, an increase in my wages, or I get a promotion based on my performance, and it's exhausting. But to know that that my relationship with Jesus and the mission that he's put me on, which is far greater, it can be in the same, he can use my profession to accomplish that mission, but the mission that I'm on for Jesus is not based on my performance, that it is based on my willingness to submit to him and his grace.
And yet we still find ourselves so consumed by performance. Mm-hmm. And I mean, Paul even kind of works back into that conversation as well, as he moves on in verse 7, when he says, "What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain." And he says the elect among them did, but others were hardened. And so again, this kind of goes back to that conversation of the remnant, of the first fruits, like the elect among them. This requires us to look back at, like, again, chapter 8, chapter 4, understanding what this means to be a part of the elect, part of the chosen people of God. It's the people who have responded to his grace. And so, like, the elect among the Israelites who are pursuing all of this, they obtained what they were seeking, but the ones who didn't respond, the ones who don't recognize, well, they were hardened. And again, in some of the things that I was listening to and reading in preparation for this, Pastor Steve Rodeheaver, put this in an incredible context for me that just made so much sense and is super applicable to Romans. And he said, let's think of Paul. Like, Paul thought he saw clearly. Like, he would find himself in the people of Israel who sought so earnestly, right? He was zealous for God. He was persecuting people who were trying to take others down this false direction of following Jesus. And he was trying to destroy heretics. Like, he was weeding them out and participating in their destruction or their imprisonment. And he was the Jew of Jews. Like, he knew the Torah inside and out. Like, he was climbing the ladder, and in everything he did, he was doing what he was supposed to according to the law. And then he finds himself on the road to Damascus, where he is blinded. And I read this statement of the elect among them did, but others were hardened. It's as if Paul on his way to Damascus, ultimately, God gave him over and took him to the ultimate hardening, where Paul thought he saw so clearly and understood everything so well. And so to really take him to that rock bottom, to harden him ultimately, he was blinded. So the very thing he thought he had was taken from him, literally. And in that moment of being blinded, in his encounter with the Christ who he was persecuting, then he began to see clearly, even though he couldn't even see out of his eyes. Then he began to understand. And so it's like, it's as if, not as if, God, in so taking him to this moment of being blind, brought him to this place where he had a decision to make. Like, he could have continued in his obstinance and rejection of the Messiah and then enjoyed his blind life of persecution of the church, or recognize that Jesus really is the Messiah and turn. And he wasn't promised that he would get his sight back by responding to Jesus as the Messiah. So it wasn't motivated of just trying to get something physical out of it. But when he was confronted with the truth, ultimately, and brought to his end, he responded. And so as we continue on and we read into these quotes where it says, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, and ears that could not hear to this very day. I don't read that as God laying judgment on a people, laying an eternal judgment on a people, a judgment of finality, where now their eyes are closed, and so there's no way they could ever understand. Yeah, they're not abandoned. Right? Like Paul addresses that through God's response to Elijah. Like, they're not abandoned. They're not ultimately rejected, but there is a hardening, there's a blinding that is occurring.
There's
again,
a giving over.
A giving over again for not for the purpose of damnation, but for the hopeful purpose of restoration. And that is what Paul experienced in his very life, where, again, thinking he sees so clearly, all of a sudden he's blinded because God he wasn't responding to God, reaching out to him through Christ. He wasn't. He was rejecting it completely. And then when he's blinded, all of a sudden he can see clearly.
Kyle Idleman, in his book, Aha, he talks about this very same concept of God working with us, pursuing us. And sometimes God's pursuit looks like giving us over to whatever it is that our stubborn hearts are so stuck on.
Right.
Because it's in our being fully given over to that hardening that we finally can be released from it. It's when we hit rock bottom that God can do his best work, that he often does his best work.
It's like Paul had a religious deconstruction.
Kind of. Probably not kind of. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, like, I feel like the blind statement in verse 8, like the quoting of the spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, like, that is directly applicable to Paul and his testimony and his witness of what happened. And then he goes and uses a quote from David where it says, "May their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them." And if I think about the first part as a confession of Paul's testimony and what it took for him to finally recognize Jesus as the Messiah, I read these words from this quote from David a little bit differently now, where it's almost as if Paul is speaking into the Jews, hopefully the thing that will help them come around to recognize Jesus as their Messiah. Because if you think about it, like the kosher laws, the table quote laws, the cleanliness laws, those are the things that really divided the Jews from everybody else. That's how people really were able to see who was Jewish and who wasn't, because they were like, well, who's eating bacon and who isn't? And so Paul then is speaking that, like, you know what? May the very thing that you cling to, may that thing be a snare and a trap to help you recognize your need for Jesus as the Messiah.
It's not a curse, it's a blessing.
Sounds like a weird blessing, like a backhanded blessing, but yeah. And as I reflect on what Paul is doing here in these last few verses of this first set that we get to in chapter 11, and think about what it might mean for me today, or what it might mean for us today, it kind of makes me ask or wonder, in what ways do I think that I see so clearly where Jesus might need to blind me so I can recognize just how far off I am? In what ways do I need Jesus to humble me? I guess another way to ask the same question, in what ways do I need to grow in my understanding of my need for him in my life, of my dependence on him in my life? Because as Paul says, it cannot be based on works. This whole thing, it's all about grace. And I think we know that. We know that in our minds, but we don't always necessarily know that in our hearts. At least we don't always live like we understand that in our hearts. Because we still too often find ourselves defaulting to trying to be good enough or do enough, rather than simply falling into the arms of Christ and depending on his grace to move forward.
It's like they know how to do, but they don't know how to be. Like they know how to do a list of laws. They know how to live that out. But they don't know how to be like the very one who gave them the law. The very one that they didn't think was the Messiah. And I'm not that much different. Like, I know how to do. I don't always know how to be.
As you journey with us, we recommend purchasing Midweek Meditations, A Journey Through Romans, Part 2, which is available for purchase on Amazon. Also, be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.